Amy Clarke, how are you?
I'm really well, my friend. It's really good to see you.
Welcome to the SoulBuffalo Earth Report. I think you're the number 5. I need to double check that, but so excited to have you on our LinkedIn Live program. And Amy Clarke is an advisor, a friend. She is the co-founder of Tribe Impact Capital and their chief impact officer. And yeah, super excited to have you here and talk a little bit about the world's financial system.
Well, I was going to say it's a small subject to cover in half an hour, but I'm sure we can do it. I'm sure we can do it well, Dave. I'm sure we can.
Let's get to the heart. I think we can probably get to the heart of it. But before we do any of that, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the ESG side of environmental, social governance side of the financial equation?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'm actually, in terms of my undergraduate degree, I'm a climate and a soil scientist. So I am, in many ways, a quintessential environmentalist. If you cut me through, Dave, I do bleed green. And then I did a master's in environmental policy and law. So I've always wanted to get into this, what we now refer to as the sustainability space. And I was really, really lucky when I came out of university because I walked into environmental consultancy just at the time when the consultancy profession and business at large was beginning to understand that its environmental footprint needed to be managed better and it needed to be understood. But also when the issue around human rights was starting to come to the fore and, human rights in your supply chain. So this notion of much broader responsible business, in the first 5 years of me working really started to a certain degree, sort of define itself. So I joined as an environmental consultant, and I worked with management consultancies for about 9 years. Yeah, about 9 years. And I went through environmental risk management to corporate social responsibility, to corporate responsibility, to sustainable business, to sustainability. So this massive kind of iteration that's still happening in many ways, because some businesses still refer to what they do as corporate social responsibility. Bit of a pet peeve. Let's not go down that road.
Fewer and fewer, I'm glad to say.
Fewer and fewer, yeah. And it is a big bugbear of mine because people often say, what's the difference between CSR and sustainability? And CSR is, in my mind, what you do with your money once you've made it. Sustainability is fundamentally about how you make your money and whether or not you have, whether or not what you're currently doing is actually able to withstand, for example, the environmental, social and governance pressures that you have within your business.
I think it's different. It's interesting when you start to think about just like the trends towards ESG. Tell us about Tribe, what you guys do, the types of companies you invest in, sort of your ethos and philosophy.
Yeah, so we're a wealth manager. So we deal with private client capital, but we also deal with charity capital, university endowment capital. We also deal with corporate capital, so cash balances that corporations have. And Tribe, we're B Corp, so we're one of the families of B Corps globally. And we invest money according to the change that is articulated in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So every single dollar, pound, euro that we have under management is managed according to its ability to actually deliver the change that the UN SDG framework and the Paris Climate Accord very comprehensively lays out. So the types of businesses that we are focusing on are those businesses that are, to put it really, really simply, well-run businesses that are solving the big economic, social, and environmental issues that we're facing. So you can think of them in many ways as the businesses of today and tomorrow, the future fit businesses, not the businesses of today and yesterday. Now, occasionally you get legacy businesses coming through who are willing to transition and pivot. And actually, we're seeing some of that with some of the plastic issues, the plastic crisis that we've got. We're starting to see potentially some of this happening with oil and gas, which is obviously the root cause of the plastic crisis.
What kind of technology from the oil and gas has you excited?
So it's not necessarily the technology; it's the leadership and the pivoting of their businesses away from black energy to green energy. So we saw it, for example, with Danish oil and natural gas, DONG, as it used to be called, which pivoted over the last 13 years, predominantly from a black energy company, 95% black energy, to today, I think it's 87% green energy. They're now called Ørsted. So we've seen that transition happen. Now, granted, the majority of that transition happened when they were owned by the Danish government, so they weren't a listed company. I think a lot of people are looking at the European oil and gas majors now with increasing levels of interest, but still huge levels of caution. They're not with the American oil and gas companies. There's a real divergence happening between, I think, the view on the climate crisis between American oil and gas super majors and the European. So BP, Shell, Total, NL, there's a lot of different kind of companies coming through in Europe who are beginning to look like they are pivoting, and they are intentionally pivoting, whereas we're still waiting for a lot of this to happen in the US, and there's, I think, a sense that it's not going to happen in the US.
Maybe not in the near term, given everything that's happening over here. Question for you. I mean, so you have, we're in a fossil fuel economy, that's for sure. We're transitioning out of it slowly, it seems. So when you just like sort of take that up to the macro level and the financial system as a whole, like how can we fix the financial system as a whole, Amy?
So it's really interesting because you and I were chatting about this just before we started this. If you think about the system and you think about the system that we built, it's largely a linear system, okay? So it doesn't deal with complexity. It's a linear system in what is a complex, multidimensional, non-linear world where the inputs and the threats that we're facing are increasingly molecular, they're invisible, and they're intersectional. So what do I mean by that? Plastic, you can't just take the plastic sort of crisis and just focus on the plastic crisis without thinking, for example, about human health, without thinking, for example, about the climate crisis. We have all this interdependency and intersectionality, and yet the system that we built, the finance system, very much deals in black and white. It doesn't deal in sort of the color in between or even the gray in between sometimes. Partly because all of those issues that we now know inform whether or not the economy is likely to grow and to sustainably grow. Access to food, access to healthcare, access to education, our use of resources, breaching nature's carrying capacity. All of these were taken out of the decision-making process in finance, what we call externalities. They were taken out of the decision-making process. This is the neoliberal model, the Friedman model. Let's take them out of the decision-making process and just focus on businesses making money. Well, businesses cannot sustainably make money if they are not dealing with these issues, not just in their businesses, but also in terms of what their products then create. So to fix the system and to fix these crises that we're facing, we have to bring these issues back into the decision-making process. We have to internalize, effectively, the externalities, which means we have to bring back in climate crisis. We have to bring back in the plastic crisis. We have to bring back in rising levels of inequality, understand why it's happened, and then support those businesses who are creating the solutions to them. And that way, we start to create much more sustainable growth, and we create a system that is much more comfortable with complexity, interdependency, and the sort of the intersectionality between all of these issues. If you think of the SDG framework, Dave, it's like a Jenga. We've all played Jenga. You get your little piles up, and the idea being that you pull the piles out before the stack.
There's always a disaster at the end of that game.
Exactly, because of the interdependency within that stack. And as soon as you start to pull any of those bricks out, you've basically eroded the integrity of the stack. And the more that you pull out, the more unstable it comes. And that's what the SDG framework is. It's this beautiful Jenga pile of relationships. So if you just focus on one goal, you miss the sometimes unintended consequences that you create elsewhere, and then the impacts that are traced throughout the other goals. So you have to think in a systems-based way. And the finance system doesn't think like that. It's linear.
I love that metaphor. It's totally got my wheels turning. So yeah, I mean, interestingly too, like last week was Climate Week, and you have all these conversations about the intersection between plastic and climate, and the fact that it's so lightweight. And in many cases, a lot of the industry groups out there would argue and have argued that, by using plastic, there's less carbon because you're not burning as much because the material is not as heavy. And then you have the environmental groups that are all of a sudden on the other side of the equation saying, wait a second, this is coming out of fossil fuels. The material is coming from natural gas and is coming from oil. And then at the end of life, it's ending up in landfills, and then there's methane and all, and that's just like existential crisis. But that is essentially what you're talking about with this game of SDG Jenga.
Yeah, exactly. And also we're up against, I think we have to recognize as well, it's not just the finance industry. I've had long conversations recently about the role of marketing industry, in that you could almost argue that since the 1950s, we have been subject to advanced psychological warfare by marketeers telling us that we don't have enough of this, we don't have enough of that. And it's all been predicated on this notion of convenience. Let us make your life, Dave, really easy for you by reducing down the amount of time and efforting, and therefore the ownership of what it is that you should be doing. We'll do it for you. Trust that we'll do it right for you. And I think you have to look at the marketing industry as well as the finance industry and say, well, between the two of them, they've done a really good job of convincing us that they have our best interests at heart. And we kind of know now that they don't.
My last guest Tuesday of this week is this guy named Joshua Spodek. He's a PhD. He's taught at NYU. He's a wild man. He is extreme. And he showed us a little tote bag of garbage, was all the garbage that he's used since December. And he'll like unplug his refrigerator for a week. He just like kind of tortures himself on purpose and gets a lot of fulfillment out of it, just trying to like basically live the life of the anti-consumer. And it's interesting for me too, because just my own personal journey is that I was a pretty significant consumer before I got into sustainability. And I actually, in previous life, I worked in advertising. So like 7 years ago, I was 35 and I left advertising and slowly made my way into this space. And yeah, how do we get everyone thinking about what they're using? And that is one of the toughest codes to crack out there.
It is. Completely. And it's taking nudge theory in many ways to the next level and saying, how do we as businesses, how do we as, investors, how do we as regulators and policymakers, how do we as marketeers, how do we in the sort of main media, how do we create these messages that actually encourage people to change their behavior, but how do we make it really easy for people to change their behavior as well? And that's
with finance, though, isn't the leverage everything? Isn't that like because if you try to educate at the consumer level, it's really, really hard. There's a lot of people out there that are just trying to put food on the table, let alone think about, to separate their 5s and 6s and 7s and whether or not to take their flexible film to, Walmart or Target to get recycled because they can't, it's just not on people's radar because there's a lot of stuff going on in the world, but you have leverage with financial institutions that are really pushing a lot of the CEOs, right? I mean, there's a silver lining. I mean, this has been happening in the last 5 years, right? I mean, this hasn't been like some, decades old move.
No, well, I mean, so ESG investing has been around for 20 years. Impact investing, and we can get into the nuances between obviously the two, more so for probably about the last 10 to 12, at a push, maybe 15 years. And there's been this evolution from mainstream ESG investing 20, 25 years ago through to impact investing today. But if you go back, you can go back hundreds of years, with faith-based investing and, some of the debt vehicles that churches may have been made available. It was done with mission and purpose in mind. So thinking about investing for an end result that is actually commensurate with the values that you hold as an individual. This is nothing new, Dave. It's really not. It's nothing new. But what it's never been is codified into the system. ESG is just a risk metric. There's an argument to say it shouldn't actually really be a style of investing because it's just one of the data points that enables you to understand whether or not the company that you are trying or potentially investing in has the requisite risk management policies, practices in place to manage the environmental, the social, and the governance-related risks in its business. What it doesn't do is tell you or fundamentally challenge what that business is doing. So it's core product and service. And this is where sustainable investing and then through to impact investing is really focusing on. Sustainable investing is looking at those companies whose products and services are sustainable. So we can continue to do these. Impact investing takes it to the next level and says, okay, well, we want companies who are well run, so ESG plus tick. We want the products and services to be sustainable, tick, but we also want the company intentionally to be trying to solve for something and solve for something meaningful. So we're looking for really additional and material products and services within these companies. It's the difference between, it's the difference between for example, a multidisciplinary FMCG, so fast moving consumer goods company that's got many different lines of products that it's got in the market, versus a company that is specifically developing reverse vending machine technology to take plastic bottles back and glass bottles back, because they are intentionally trying to solve the waste crisis. Now, the FMCG company may have a really good ESG metric. It may be really starting to think about, the products and the services and making sure that they're not breaching nature's capacity. They're treating their staff really well, and that they are, they're starting to move the products into a space where potentially they are additive in creating long-term sustainable change. But they're not what we would term a mission-driven or an intentional company across their entire footprint. And impact investing tends to focus there on those companies that have the solutions, that are solutions-oriented and are only focused on solutions.
So I keep thinking about Milton Friedman. We talk about Milton Friedman in 1970 and, his ethos, and you hear more and more like Milton Friedman's probably rolling in his grave because the world has changed in such a big way. Like, when you have such an entrenched system that fosters so many inequalities, what are the first steps to change? Is it all policy and regulation happening on a macro scale? You obviously have 193 member countries that are all doing things, United Nations member companies that are doing so much different. What could be some of the catalytic events that could really change this system, sooner than later?
So COVID is changing the system. This is what's really interesting. When you look at what's been happening with the flow of capital in finance for the duration of this year, we've seen significant uplifts in the amount of capital that's flowing into ESG funds. So funds that are at least beginning to look at companies through the lens of their ability to manage the externalities and the risk that externalities pose to their business. So we've started to see that really ramp up during this year. And that's because there's a baked-in resilience to ESG investing, because you are focusing basically on better run companies. Now, you may still pick up, you've probably seen in the US, I think about 20 ESG funds were holding Boohoo, which is a fast fashion company based out in the UK, which was exposed for having significant human rights breaches in its supply chain in the UK as well as overseas. So ESG is not a foolproof, obviously, style of investing, but we have seen such an incredible uptick in inward flow into the ESG funds in the UK. And I think, between April and June of this year in the UK alone, we have £1.2 billion worth of capital flowing into ESG funds. And that is more than the combined amount of capital flowing into ESG funds for the last 5 years.
Game on.
Yeah, exactly. Game on. So big shift. And this is being played out, around the world. Europe is leading the charge here, but we're seeing this massive shift into ESG. And if you think of ESG as a bellwether for market sentiment, investors flee for safe harbors in the face of crises. And it would appear now as if they're fleeing to ESG, but also this has been bolstered by the fact that ESG is outperforming its non-ESG counterparts. And we knew that was happening pre the COVID crisis because there's plenty of data out there to confirm that was the case. But we've also seen now that ESG is outperforming its non-ESG counterparts in the face of these global crises. So nothing gets the system's attention than good performance. Nothing gets it better than good performance. And the fear of risk, the fear of underperformance. So we've seen already this seismic shift that has happened in finance. And it's not going to be, despite I think what some naysayers may say, it's not going to be a flash in the pan. I think the system is becoming critically aware of itself and critically aware of the level of risk that it has in. So the system is changing because it's becoming aware of itself. I think regulation and policy, absolutely. Massive role there. Huge role for regulation and policy to come on. And this is where we're starting to tackle things like fiduciary duty. And what is fiduciary duty? And obviously, we've seen in the US recently, the Department of Labor effectively trying to restrict pension fund money going into ESG funds because citing that as being a breach of fiduciary duty. And the big American, institutional investors and the rest of the world are sitting there going, hang on, how does that work? That's counterintuitive. I mean, that's seriously counterintuitive because ESG is about risk management. So how can you argue that it's risky to go into a risk-adjusted portfolio? Go figure. So there are still, as I said, some naysayers out there, but the industry, I think, is moving. I think regulators are beginning to understand that actually there needs to be more clarity on the interpretation of fiduciary duty. The accountants have now waded into the ring. I mean, 10 years ago, if I said to you, Dave, the accountants are going to save the world, you would have looked at me and gone, really, Amy?
We need the accountants on board, that's for sure.
We need the accountants.
How do we get, so it's amazing to hear that there's so much energy that's happening, and any kind of COVID silver lining with the environment is amazing. Ocean plastics has not seen that silver lining. Absolutely the opposite. The system's been exposed. There's more leakage. There's less going into waste management. It's pretty tricky. So like when you look at ESG and sort of the bigger investment and the bigger money going to more established companies, at least that's the way I think of it, and tell me if I'm wrong, but then you'll have this like class of emerging technologies and goods and plastic alternatives, and just like the next wave of innovation. It's like, how do we get more money into that sector as well? And I know you guys make some investments there with closed loop partners, Circulate Capital, or a part of the Ocean Plastic Leadership Network. It's like, there's so many companies that are just on the cusp, and how do we just harness that power?
So I think a lot of that is actually what Closed Loop and the team over at Closed Loop, who I have so much time for, part of what they're doing is bringing these big corporate entities alongside these smaller organizations, so that they're able to sort of say, look, we have this incredible, Dave, I've got an amazing widget. I need you to buy my widget because my widget's going to change the world. And Dave, you work for Coca-Cola. And I'm going, this is going to radically change Coca-Cola's fortune, okay? And it's got a phenomenal impact on managing an externality for you. This is great. Being able to broker those types of relationships when, I'm kind of saying, but Dave, I need a bit of money. I need you to kind of invest in me. I've got private capital coming in. So I've got private finance from individuals, from private equity firms, etc. But actually, I could really do with having a corporate alongside me, and maybe you want to invest in me. That's smart, okay? It's brokering relationships, it's creating that connectivity, and it's creating a supply chain as well, which I think we need more of. There is a huge, at any one time, there's $300 trillion worth of money floating around the markets. There's more than enough money to do what it is that we need to do. What we have to do is to get it charged and directed to where it needs to get to. That is the role of the private equity industry to a certain degree in fostering these companies and helping these companies find the capital. It needs to be patient capital. So, it needs to be willing to sit with its investee over a longer period of time to enable this investee company to trial, to do the R&D, to get it to where it needs to get to in terms of then being saleable either into a supply chain or directly into the market. Finance has a huge role in that. It has a huge role in that. Private capital has a huge role in that as well. The role of the professional investor, whether it's, again, institutional or private. There is so much opportunity out in the marketplace, but for me, and I don't think it's a question of there's a lack of money. It's not about a lack of money. For me, I think it's about the lack of connectivity between the innovations and the R&D that may be happening. And I listened to your the
John Ward.
Yes, I was going to say the interview, whatever you
call it. Green chemistry. I'm going to call with him today. That guy is in my mind every time I sit across.
Well, you just kind of want to open his head and suck his brain out, and kind of go, wow, what you have in there, mate, is absolutely amazing. It's extraordinary. How do I get it? Give me some. But, you want to be able to partner that kind of thinking, that kind of innovation, that capacity for R&D, where you find that inner John or all the Johns who are out there globally in these incredible businesses. You want to be able to ensure that there is clear line of sight into supply chain or into consumers to crowd more money in terms of, then the investment. That's the thing. It's confidence. It's building the confidence of the finance system that these investments are good investments, as well as then getting them comfortable with longer term, horizons in terms of how long that capital potentially is going to be locked up for. It's starting to happen, though. I think it is starting to happen. The one thing we haven't touched on actually is us as citizens, us as wealth holders. There are, if I look at the UK, for example, Richard Curtis, Love Actually, For Weddings and a Funeral, just in case you forgot who he was, not Tony Curtis.
I forgot. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, not Tony Curtis, Richard Curtis. It has launched a new campaign called Make My Money Matter. which is great because, with his profile and his incredible ability to develop and release these, really compelling narratives and also creative material in terms of videos and films. It's like a clarion call to us all as pension. For those of us in the UK, a lot of people in the UK have pensions, whether they're company pensions or private pensions. The clarion call to say, to put it in no finer term, Dave, do you know where your money's sleeping at night? Is it having a dirty little affair with the businesses that actually you would have an apoplectic seizure over? Do you know where your pension's invested?
If you're investing in Vanguard funds, you don't know where all that is going, right?
But you can find out because you can ask your pension provider to provide you with the look through and the transparency. I think we all have to remember with whatever investments we might have or savings, we have things over here called ISAs. Ultimately, Dave, it's your money, it's your wealth. It's not theirs, it's yours. So you have a right to know where it's invested. You have a right to know whether or not it's reflecting your values and your belief systems. Your money should be working harder for the change that you want to see out in society. Not the other way around. And when you have people like Richard Curtis coming alongside, with these big clarion calls, these siren calls to the community at large saying, make your money matter, know where it's invested, make the decisions, get it into the businesses that reflect the change that you want to see happening out in society. Don't let it be having a dirty affair whilst you're sleeping. And when you make it easy for people to then take those actions, people do effectively, act. But you have to make things easy for people. You're now going to sit when you go to bed later at night, kind of going, I don't actually.
I'm having lots of things over here. You're watching it in real time. I just think, what would you say what are you most excited? Like, we've got 3 minutes left. What are you most excited about in the space that you play every single day?
So one of the things that I'm really, really super, super, super psyched about, I think, at the moment is decentralization, because I think it has a massive role in the plastic crisis. So we're talking about decentralized food as one area. If you think about, again, plastics, a lot of the, a lot of the marketing, a lot of the rationale for using plastics is that it helps food travel better. It's, more hygienic for the food. Well, what if the food had to travel less? What if the food was more locally sourced and locally grown? The system predicates and, thrives because it's a centralized model. Let's decentralize it. Decentralizing sort of supply chains actually reduces the need in many industries for the amount of plastic that we're currently using. So let's not just focus on what the plastic alternatives are. Let's actually focus on what's happening within the system that drives the use of plastic. So for me, decentralization, and we're seeing that in the UK with the rise of community farms, local organic delivery boxes, that we're seeing in France, etc. as well, and around Europe. It's happening in the US. That is really exciting. More local engagement and more local businesses.
I read something the other day, like the word supply chain this year, for COVID reasons, obviously has been used like 900 times in its normal sitting. A lot of folks that are that are deeply involved in the supply chain or in the network, and it's just really fascinating when you're talking to. I'm talking to a group of university students that are in supply chain management, and when I was in college, I was a marketing degree. My buddy went into logistics and supply chain, and I just thought that was so boring, and I just was so wrong. Nowadays, if you're sitting in front of a group of students and they ask how can they play a role in changing the world, I would say go into supply chain. Mm-hmm. What I know 23 years later, but and I think when we look at like the movement that has happened around the supply chain in general and how fast supply chains moved through COVID, much faster than they thought. But a lot of these opportunities and these local opportunities that you're talking about, we're seeing all around the world directly because of COVID-19. So anyway.
Well, exactly. I mean, if you've got a computer, you've got an American company manufacturing a computer in China, which is coming back to America for sale. You kind of got to ask, what's wrong with the system? This is a little bit nuts here because we've created these complex global supply chains. Maybe we need to create franchise models with businesses where you have decentralized supply chains. Chinese, so you've got food that's being grown for the Chinese in China. You've got food that's being grown for the Americans in America. You're reducing down the need for potentially, as I said, plastics, but you're also increasing local resilience. So in the face of these pandemics, you're not having supply chains freeze and effectively stall. We have to focus on resilience, and that's not an anti-globalization agenda at all. It's about recognizing that somewhere between being too localized and too globalized is a happier space for us all.
I think that is an absolute incredible point to end on. Hashtag practical. And just so grateful, Amy, for coming on our LinkedIn Live today. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure. It's been good fun.
Amy Clarke, live from the UK. Tribe Impact Capital, dear friend, dear advisor, and love to do this again too. So any last words before we jump?
No, other than if you don't know where your pension's invested, Dave, when you get off this call, I suggest you go and find out.
I sure will. Thank you. Anyway, have a really great day, Amy. And we're going to be back next Tuesday and Thursday for more LinkedIn Live SoulBuffalo Earth Reports. Thanks so much.